Everyone in the village called her the monster child of Blackthorn Hall. The Duke was ready to send her away forever. Then her new tutor did something none of the others ever thought to do. He simply sat down beside her. The coachman refused to take him past the iron gates. Elias Whitmore had noticed the man's hands tighten on the reins long before the fog swallowed the last of the village lights behind them. 3 miles of empty moorland road, and the fellow had barely breathed, his jaw locked like a rusted hinge. When the dark outline of Blackthorn Hall finally rose from the gray evening, stone towers pressing into the low sky, windows lit with a sickly amber glow, the coachman hauled the horses to a stop a full 20 yards short of the entrance and turned around without once meeting Elias's eyes. "Into my road, sir. The gates are 20 yards ahead." He said nothing further. Elias stepped down onto the gravel, pulling his traveling coat tighter against the bite of the October wind. He lifted his leather bag from the footboard himself, since the coachman clearly had no intention of moving from his seat, and watched the carriage wheels crunch back into the dark without so much as a farewell lantern swing. In 20 years of taking posts across Yorkshire, he had been delivered to rectories, to crumbling farmhouses, to households where the fathers drank and the mothers wept. He had never been abandoned at the gate. He turned to face Blackthorn Hall. It was enormous, the kind of enormous that seemed personal, as though the building had been deliberately designed to make whoever stood before it feel insufficient. 3 stories of dark limestone, gabled rooftops vanishing into low cloud, and a gravel forecourt wide enough to exercise horses. Ivy climbed the eastern face like something trying to escape. Gas lamps flanked the entrance porch and threw orange light across the stone in long, trembling strips. Elias was halfway up the forecourt when he stopped. There was a child standing at the far edge of the gravel, beside the stone wall that separated the main grounds from the moors. She was perhaps 8 years old, small and slight, dressed in a white cotton nightgown already dark at the hem with rainwater. Her feet were bare against the gravel. Her dark hair hung loose and damp around her shoulders. She was not crying. She was not calling out. She was simply standing in the October rain, perfectly still, watching him the way a deer watches before it decides to run. Around her, at a careful distance of some 15 feet, stood 4 servants, 2 footmen in their dark livery and 2 housemaids in their caps and aprons, none of whom appeared to have any intention of approaching her. One of the maids had her hands clasped to her chest. One of the footmen had taken an actual step backward. Elias set down his bag. He did not run to the child, did not call her name, did not signal to the servants. He simply walked toward her at an ordinary pace, hands loose at his sides, as though he was walking to check whether the garden wall needed repointing. He stopped about 6 feet away and looked at her. She looked back at him. Her eyes were very dark, almost black in the lamplight, and there was nothing blank about them. They were sharp and watchful and full of something that was working very hard to look like nothing at all. "Cold evening," Elias said pleasantly. She said nothing. "I've just arrived from Harrogate. Dreadful road in the rain." He tilted his head slightly toward the hall. "I don't suppose you know whether supper has been laid yet." Still nothing. But she had not moved away. He picked up his bag again, turned toward the hall, and walked past her at a measured distance. Not too close. Not making a production of leaving her alone, simply going where he was going. He had gone about 8 steps when he heard the faint crunch of small feet on wet gravel behind him. He did not look back. Inside, the entrance hall smelled of beeswax and cold stone, and something faintly floral that could not quite cover the deeper smell of a house too large for the people living in it. A butler materialized from the shadow beneath the staircase and took Elias's coat with an expression of such studied blankness that it communicated more than a full sentence would have. Duke Edmund Ravenscroft was waiting in the study. He was a tall man, thin in the manner of someone who had once been broader and had simply forgotten to eat his way through grief. His dark coat was expensive and immaculately pressed. His hair was silver at the temples. He was standing with his back to the door when Elias entered, staring into a fire that had burned down to dull red coals, and he did not immediately turn around. "You came on foot from the gates," the Duke said. "The coachman had a prior engagement." A pause. "They usually do." He turned then, and his eyes moved over Elias with the efficiency of a man accustomed to assessing things quickly and finding them wanting. "You are younger than I expected." "I am 32, Your Grace. Yes. And the last man I engaged was 54 and lasted 11 days. He moved to his desk and sat, gesturing to the chair opposite. I will spare you the formality of a slow introduction, Mr. Whitmore. 99 people have held your position before you. Governesses, tutors, nannies from as far as Edinburgh and Bristol. The last came with 3 letters of commendation from a viscount's household. He paused. She was found at 6 in the morning sitting in the kitchen yard in her traveling clothes, bag already packed, unable to explain herself beyond the word unnatural. Elias held the Duke's gaze. What does Lyra do? The Duke seemed briefly surprised that the question had been so direct. He folded his hands on the desk. She does not speak. She has not spoken a single word in 6 years. Not to me, not to any member of this household, not to any of the 99 people I have brought here on her behalf. When she is distressed, and she is distressed often, and without apparent cause, she destroys things. Windows, furniture. She once removed every portrait from the east corridor and stacked them face down in the cellar overnight. No one saw her do it. He looked at the fire. She refuses physical contact entirely. She does not eat in the dining room. She does not sleep regular hours. She draws. He said this last word in a tone that suggested drawing was also suspicious. Constantly. Every surface she can reach. And the West Wing. The Duke's eyes returned to him sharply. What about it? Your housekeeper. I passed her in the corridor. She crossed herself when I asked which wing faced the moors. I assumed it was significant. A long silence. The West Wing has been sealed since my wife's passing. 6 years ago, his voice carried no particular emotion when he said this, which in Elias's experience meant considerable emotion being held at a firm distance. Lyra is not to be taken there. She is not to be encouraged in whatever imaginings she have developed on the subject. He stood, which apparently meant the introduction was finished. I will be clear with you, Mr. Whitmore. This is the child's final season under this roof. If you cannot produce some measurable improvement in her conduct and communication by spring, she will be sent to a suitable establishment in the South, a place that manages such cases. Elias stood as well and picked up his hat. I understand, Your Grace. The Duke studied him for a moment more. You do not seem alarmed. No. Every other man I've said that to has been alarmed. Elias thought of the child standing barefoot in the rain, watching him with those sharp dark eyes that were working so hard to look empty. A child who had not spoken in 6 years but who had, he now understood, followed a stranger across a dark forecourt because something about his manner had given her some tiny, unnamed reason to move. I don't think she is what everyone here believes her to be, Elias said simply. He was shown to his room on the 2nd floor, large and cold, with a view across the black moorland and a fireplace that had already been lit. He unpacked methodically. 2 suits, his books, his writing case, his pipe, which he rarely smoked but liked to have near. He washed his hands and face at the basin and stood for a moment at the window, watching rain move across the moors in long silver sheets. It was almost midnight when he crossed to the door to check the latch and found that something had already been slipped beneath it. He crouched and picked it up. It was a piece of cartridge paper, roughly the size of his palm, folded once. Inside, drawn in charcoal with a precision that had no business belonging to an 8-year-old hand, was a key. A long, slender key with an unusual 3-pronged bow, rendered in careful detail. Below the drawing, in small and deliberate letters, the first letters this child had apparently committed to paper in 6 years that were not a picture. He sees it too. Elias sat on the edge of his bed for a long time, holding the drawing, listening to the rain against the window and the deep silence of the house. Somewhere beneath that silence, something had been buried. And whatever it was, the child had been trying to dig it up alone for a very long time. The drawing stayed on Elias's writing table for 3 days. He did not pin it to the wall, did not show it to anyone, did not mention it to the Duke or Mrs. Holloway or any of the tight-lipped footmen who appeared at mealtimes like ghosts performing a function. He simply left it there, in plain sight, on the off chance that Lyra passed his room and looked through the gap beneath the door. He wanted her to know he had kept it. The second drawing arrived on the morning of his 3rd day. This one was slipped beneath the library door while he was inside taking his breakfast tea alone. He had taken to eating there rather than the vast empty dining room, where a single place setting looked almost satirical against the length of the mahogany table. He heard nothing. No footsteps, no rustle of paper, no retreating steps in the corridor. One moment the floor near the door was bare, and the next, when he glanced up from his cup, a folded square of cartridge paper was sitting against the skirting board as though it had always been there. He waited a full minute before retrieving it. A corridor this time, drawn from a low angle, as though the artist had been sitting on the floor, which she probably had. The perspective was unsettling in its accuracy. The proportions of the doors, the exact droop of the wall sconces, the way shadow gathered in the far corner where the passage turned. At the end of the corridor, barely suggested in a few spare lines, was a door. Beneath the door, a thin strip of light. He folded the paper and placed it beside the first. Over the following days, more came. A candle stand with an unusual base, 3 legs, clawed feet, a style he had not seen elsewhere in the house. A raven perched on what appeared to be a window ledge, its eye rendered with a single precise that managed to look knowing. A ceiling rose with a crack running through its center. And then, again, the key, drawn a second time, larger now, with more detail at the bow, 3 prongs arranged in a pattern that was not decorative but deliberate, like a symbol rather than an ornament. Elias pinned them all in order on the inside of his wardrobe door. He saw Lyra in passing during those days, though passing was perhaps the wrong word for something so careful and considered. She appeared at the end of corridors and vanished before he reached them. She sat in the window seat of the upstairs landing with a board across her knees and her charcoal moving in quick, certain strokes, and when he climbed the stairs she did not leave, but she turned the board face down against her knees and watched him with those dark, measuring eyes until he had gone by. Small tests, he understood. She was checking whether he would grab at her, speak too loudly, make demands. He did none of those things, and she seemed to be tallying the results somewhere privately. It was Mrs. Beatrice Holloway who finally gave him the fuller picture. The housekeeper was a stout woman of around 60, with a ring of household keys at her waist that chimed softly whenever she moved, and a manner that suggested she had been managing difficult situations since before Elias was born. She took tea in her sitting room off the kitchen passage at 4 o'clock each afternoon without exception, and on his 4th day, she left the door open. He took that as an invitation. 6 years, she said, pouring without being asked, which he appreciated. Lady Ravenscroft passed in the October of 1858, right here in this house. Lyra was 2 years old. She was already speaking by then, mind you. Early for her age, the nursemaid always said. Full sentences before her 2nd birthday. She set the pot down and looked at her cup. She stopped the same week her mother died. Went to bed one night saying good night and woke up the next morning with nothing. Not a sound since. What did the physician say? Several physicians. Over several years, Mrs. Holloway's expression conveyed her opinion of physicians economically. Shock, grief, a sensitive disposition. Nothing that explained why a child who had been perfectly healthy and perfectly talkative should simply choose silence one morning and maintain it for 6 years. She paused. She didn't choose it. That was always my feeling. Something made her quiet. Something she saw or heard that she had no words for, or that she didn't dare put into words. Elias turned his teacup once in its saucer. And the West Wing. Lady Ravenscroft died inside it. In the old ballroom, Mrs. Holloway said this plainly, though her hand had stilled on the table. His Grace sealed the wing within the week. Lyra has never been permitted inside since. Elias nodded slowly and let the subject rest there. That afternoon, returning through the library with a volume of natural history he had found wedged behind a row of legal texts, he stopped at the fireplace. On the mantelpiece, pushed almost entirely behind a brass candlestick, was a small music box in dark lacquered wood. He might have ignored it entirely except that on the lid, inlaid in pale wood, was a symbol. 3 prongs, arranged in exactly the pattern Lyra had drawn on the key. He stood very still for a moment, then opened the music box. The mechanism inside had long since wound down. But in the shallow velvet tray where a trinket might be kept, there was nothing. Whatever had once sat there was already gone. The decision to ride to Dunmere came after breakfast on a gray Tuesday morning when the moors were the color of old pewter and the sky sat so low it seemed to press against the upper windows of the hall. Elias told no one where he was going. He asked only for a horse from the stable, received one. A steady brown cob with a white blaze and the sensible temperament of an animal that had learned to ask no questions, and set off down the moorland road at a trot. He had two reasons for going. The first was that in a house where every servant measured their words like expensive spice, the village was likely to be considerably more forthcoming. The second reason he kept to himself. The music box symbol had not left his mind since the previous afternoon. If that mark meant something to the Ravencroft family, someone in Dunmere had likely seen it before. Old families leave traces in villages the way rivers leave traces in stone, slowly and everywhere. Dunmere was 4 miles east and announced itself first as a smell of coal smoke and fresh bread, then as a cluster of stone buildings gathered around a market square that had seen better decades. A coaching inn sat at one corner, a small church at another, and between them stretched a row of modest shop fronts, a draper, a butcher, a tea house with a fogged window, and a clockmaker's narrow premises wedged between the butcher and a cobbler as though it had arrived late and been given whatever space remained. He tied the cob outside the tea house and went in. The conversation stopped before the door had fully swung shut behind him. For women at the nearest table looked at him with the particular expression of people who already know who you are and where you have come from. A man near the fire with a newspaper folded on his knee did not look up, which was its own kind of looking. The girl behind the counter smiled with her mouth only and asked what he would take. Tea, Elias said pleasantly. And whatever that is, he nodded toward the tray of currant buns on the shelf behind her. He ate slowly and let the room settle back around him. Within 10 minutes, the women at the nearest table had resumed talking, and within 20, as he had expected, one of them, a sharp-faced woman in a dark wool dress who had been stealing glances at him since he sat down, leaned across with the directness of someone who had decided curiosity outweighed caution. You'll be the new man at Blackthorn Hall, then. I will. She exchanged a look with the woman beside her. How long do you mean to stay? Until spring, at least. Another exchange of looks, this one carrying more information than he could fully read. The woman in the dark dress folded her hands on the table. The child, she said carefully. Has she done anything yet? It was not quite a question. He noticed that. Lady Lyra is a perfectly interesting little girl, Elias said, and left it there. The woman sat back and said nothing further, but her expression, a mixture of disbelief and something closer to pity, stayed with him as he paid and stepped back into the gray morning air. The clockmaker's shop was so narrow inside that 2 people standing side by side would have been an inconvenience. Every surface held a clock in some stage of life or death, ticking ones, silent ones, cases open and innards exposed like small mechanical surgeries in progress. The man behind the workbench was very old, with the long, careful fingers of someone who had spent a lifetime handling small things, and he looked up at Elias over his spectacles without surprise. I heard you'd come to the village, he said. Word travels faster than horses out here. Elias smiled and picked up a small carriage clock from the nearest shelf, turning it over in his hands. I wanted to ask about the night Lady Ravencroft died. The old man set down his tool. A long pause. Outside, a cart horse clattered over the cobblestones, and the sound faded into the distance. 6 years ago this October, he said finally. Yes. 3 of the hall servants came through the village that same night. Past midnight. On foot, carrying their bags. Didn't stop at the inn, didn't speak to anyone. Just walked straight through and kept on toward the Harrowgate Road. He picked his tool back up, but didn't use it. I was up late myself. Heard something carry across the moors before they arrived. Piano music. Clear as anything, even at that distance. Elias looked up from the clock. From the hall. From the direction of it, though his grace had gone to Edinburgh that week. The hall was meant to be near empty. The old man's eyes were steady above his spectacles. Whatever was played, it weren't a servant amusing themselves. It was proper music. Formal-like. And then it stopped. And then those 3 came through the village, and the next morning the word came that her ladyship was gone. Elias set the carriage clock back on the shelf. He rode back toward Blackthorn Hall through the thinning afternoon fog, turning the clockmaker's words over and examining them from every angle, and he nearly missed it entirely. Would have missed it, had the cob not shied slightly at the roadside. He steadied the horse and looked to see what had startled it. The abandoned chapel sat perhaps 10 yards from the road, its roof half collapsed and its single window long since empty of glass. The door, old oak, black with damp, was still standing, and carved into the wood at eye level, recent enough that the cuts were still pale against the weathered surface, was the same three-pronged symbol from the music box lid. Someone had been here recently. Elias looked at it for a long time, then turned the cob toward home. The storm arrived on a Wednesday. It came the way Yorkshire storms always came, without particular announcement, simply a darkening of the afternoon sky until the moors outside disappeared behind solid curtains of rain and the hall windows ran with water from top to bottom. The gas lamps were lit by 3 o'clock. By 4, the wind was pressing against the stone walls with enough force to make the older timbers inside the house answer back with long, low groans. Elias spent the early part of the evening in the library going through the natural history volume he had found, though his attention kept sliding from the page. He had said nothing to anyone about the chapel carving. He had said nothing about the clockmaker's account of piano music drifting across the moors on the night Lady Ravenscroft died. He was building something in his mind, an arrangement of pieces that did not yet form a complete picture, but whose edges were beginning to suggest the shape of one. And he had learned long ago that speaking too early scattered the pieces before they were properly laid. He closed the book at 8:30 and went upstairs. The corridor on the second floor was quiet and lamplit, the kind of quiet that a large house produces at night when most of its occupants have retired and the remaining sounds, settling wood, the distant passage of a servant below stairs, rain on glass, serve only to measure how much silence surrounds them. Elias walked toward his room at the eastern end, passing the locked door of the west wing where the corridor made a right-hand turn and a heavier silence began. He had gone about 3 paces past that turn when he stopped. Music, faint, and coming from somewhere beyond the locked door. A piano, played with both hands, the melody unhurried and formal in the way of an older composition, something written to be played in a room with high ceilings and good acoustics. Not a servant picking out a tune with one finger. This was someone who had been taught properly, who understood what they were doing with each phrase. It lasted perhaps 30 seconds, then faded into the sound of rain on the roof above. Elias stood in the corridor and did not move. He waited a full minute. The music did not return. He tried the door to the west wing, locked, as it had been every time before, the keyhole dark and admitting no light from the other side. He pressed his ear briefly to the wood and heard only his own pulse and the rain. He stepped back and looked down. At the base of the locked door, curled on the floorboards with her knees drawn up and her drawing board against her chest, was Lyra. She was wearing her nightgown and her feet were bare, which appeared to simply be the way she preferred to exist in this house regardless of the temperature. Her dark eyes came up to his face with an expression he was beginning to recognize, that careful, measuring steadiness, as though she were reading something in him that other people had never thought to look for. He sat down on the floor beside her. Not close, perhaps 3 feet of corridor between them. She watched him do this without moving away. That alone felt significant. Every previous occasion on which an adult had lowered themselves to her level had apparently ended with Lyra relocating rapidly. She stayed. For a while they simply sat. The rain moved across the roof. The lamp at the far end of the corridor threw their shadows long against the opposite wall. Then, without any signal Elias could identify, she turned the drawing board and held it briefly toward him. It was a new sketch. The ballroom. He recognized the proportions from the description Mrs. Holloway had given him once in passing, the arched windows and the double doors. The room in the drawing was full of sheeted furniture, the shapes beneath the cloth suggested in soft, smudged lines. Above the fireplace, a portrait. A woman in a high-collared dress with her hair drawn back, her expression calm and composed in the way of formal portraits. Around her neck, on a fine chain, hung the key. The same key. Every time, the same key. Elias looked at the drawing for a long moment, and then looked at Lyra. She was watching him with an intensity that had nothing childish about it. She needed him to understand something specific, and she had been trying to communicate it for a very long time to people who had called her unnatural and packed their bags before dawn. He pointed gently at the portrait in the drawing, then at the key the woman was wearing. Lyra gave one small, deliberate nod. A crack of lightning lit the corridor white through the window at the far end, and the thunder followed almost immediately, a deep rolling crack that shook the glass in its frames. Lyra flinched hard, her breath catching, the drawing board pressed tight against her chest. Her eyes went to the window, then back to the locked door, and then she raised one hand and pointed at the portrait in her own drawing with a kind of desperate urgency, as though the storm had reminded her how little time there was for anything to be uncertain. Then the footsteps came, heavy, deliberate, from the direction of the main staircase, and behind them, the jangle of a large key ring. Elias had just enough time to recognize the tread as belonging to Mr. Graves, the senior steward, before the man appeared at the end of the corridor with a lamp held high and an expression that managed to be both unsurprised and deeply disapproving at once. Mr. Whitmore, a pause. Lady Lyra, another pause, longer. His Grace does not permit occupancy of this corridor after 9 o'clock. He crossed to the west wing door without another word, checked the lock, and stood beside it in a manner that made his meaning perfectly clear. Elias rose, brushed off his trousers, and looked down at Lyra. She was already on her feet, drawing board tucked under her arm, face closed off again completely, the shutters back down, every trace of urgency sealed away behind that careful blankness. But she had pointed at the portrait, and Elias had seen it. Mrs. Holloway found him first, or rather, she arranged to be found by him, which was a different thing entirely. Elias had come down to the kitchen passage at 6:30 in the morning, earlier than usual, intending to take his tea before the rest of the household stirred. She was already there, seated at the long wooden table with a candle burning beside her cup, and her expression carried the particular quality of someone who had decided overnight to do something they had been putting off for a considerable while. She did not greet him. She simply said, "Sit down, Mr. Whitmore," and poured him a cup without asking. He sat. She turned the candle slightly on the table, as though adjusting it, though it needed no adjusting. "There are passages beneath this house," she said quietly. "Servant passages, mostly, built into the original construction for practical reasons. Coal deliveries, laundry, access between wings without crossing the main rooms." She looked at him steadily. "They connect most of the house, including the west wing." Elias set down his cup. "I have worked in this house for 31 years, Mrs. Holloway continued. "I was here when His Grace and Lady Ravenscroft were first married. I was here when Lady Lyra was born. I was here the night Lady Ravenscroft died." She folded her hands on the table. "And I have watched 11 governesses, 22 nannies, assorted tutors and nurses and gentlemen such as yourself come and go through this house, and not one of them ever sat down on the floor of a corridor to keep that child company." Elias said nothing. "The entrance to the lower passage is behind the coal store. Third panel from the left. It lifts rather than pulls." She rose, collected her cup, and moved toward the kitchen. At the door she stopped without turning around. "I will be visiting my sister in the village this afternoon between 2 and 4 o'clock, as I do every Thursday." She left him to his tea. He went in at 10 minutes past 2. The passage behind the coal store was low-ceilinged and narrow, built for functionality without any concession to comfort, the stone walls close enough on either side that his shoulders nearly brushed both at once. He carried a small oil lamp and moved slowly, partly because the footing was uneven and partly because he wanted to understand the layout before committing to a direction. The passage branched twice. The second branch ran toward the western end of the house, and the air there was different, staler, undisturbed, carrying the specific quality of a space that had been sealed from one side for several years. The door at the far end was not locked from this side. It opened into a narrow anteroom stacked with sheeted furniture and rolled carpets, the overflow of a house clearing itself out after a death. Beyond that was the west wing proper, a corridor of the same dark limestone as the rest of the hall, but with dust on every surface thick enough to hold footprints. Elias paused and looked at the floor. There were footprints already, small ones, bare feet, the size of a child's. Lyra had found this passage long before he had. The ballroom was at the far end of the wing. Its double doors stood slightly ajar, not forced, simply unlatched, as though someone had passed through recently and seen no reason to pull them shut again. Inside, the room was exactly as her drawing had shown it. Sheeted shapes ranged along the walls, white under the gray light from the tall, arched windows. The fireplace dominated the far wall, a massive limestone surround with carved details running up the pilasters on either side. Above it, the portrait. The woman in the painting was young, younger than Elias had imagined from the Duke's manner of speaking about her, as though grief had aged her posthumously in his telling. She was dark-haired and fine-featured, her expression composed in the formal manner of portraiture, but with something in the eyes that the painter had either captured accidentally or been skilled enough to preserve deliberately. A kind of watchfulness. Lyra had those same eyes. The key hung at her throat on a fine chain, exactly as drawn. He turned from the portrait and looked at the fireplace surround more carefully. The carving on the left pilaster was decorative at the top, foliate patterns, small birds, but toward the base it changed. The same three-pronged symbol, rendered in stone, incorporated into the design as though it had always simply been ornamental. Below it, at the very base of the pilaster where the stone met the hearthstone, a seam ran where there should not have been one. He crouched and ran his thumb along it. A rectangle, roughly the size of a document box, cut so precisely into the stonework that it would be invisible unless you were looking for exactly this. A cabinet. Locked. He sat back on his heels and thought about the music box on the library mantelpiece, the symbol on the lid, the empty velvet tray inside. Something had been kept in that tray. A key, presumably, and someone had removed it before he arrived. He stood and looked once more at the portrait. At the key around Lady Ravencroft's neck, rendered in careful oil paint by a hand that had probably never imagined what the painting would eventually mean to a child left alone in a silent house with nothing but charcoal and cartridge paper. He needed that key, and he was increasingly certain that Lyra already knew exactly where it was. The hunting invitation came on a Friday morning. A folded note slipped under Elias's door, not by small bare feet this time, but by the formal hand of a footman who knocked once and retreated before Elias had fully crossed the room. The note was brief, in the Duke's narrow, precise script, requesting Mr. Whitmore's company on a shooting walk across the North Moors the following morning. Not a question. The Duke did not appear to phrase things as questions when he could avoid it. Elias wrote back accepting and spent the rest of the day wondering what had prompted it. They set out at 7 the following morning, the Duke and Elias and two silent gamekeepers who walked at a useful distance behind and communicated primarily through small movements of their caps. The frost had come overnight and the moorland was stiff and silver underfoot. The heather collapsed flat beneath it, the sky above a hard pale blue that promised cold for the remainder of the day. Their breath came in small clouds. The Duke walked with his shotgun broken over his arm and said nothing for the first mile, which Elias found entirely comfortable. It was the Duke who broke the silence. "She drew on the dining room wall this morning," he said. "Floor to ceiling, left side of the chimney breast. Ravens, mostly. And the key again." He said it without anger, which was itself a change from the clipped, contained tone he had used during their first meeting. This was something closer to resignation. "Graves wants to whitewash it. I told him to leave it." Elias looked across the frost-covered moor. "I'm glad you did." A pause. The gamekeepers behind them flushed a bird from the heather, and it rose in a fast dark arc against the pale sky. The Duke raised his gun, then lowered it again without firing. An unusual thing for a man who had organized this outing specifically to shoot. "She was not always this way," the Duke said. "I know." She spoke. "Constantly, from what the nursemaid told me. I was away a great deal in those years, managing the estate affairs, the parliamentary business." He stopped walking for a moment and looked out across the moors with the expression of a man reviewing a long account and finding the numbers unforgivable. "I was away when her mother died. I came home to a house in disorder and a child who had gone silent overnight, and a west wing I could not bring myself to enter, and I made the considerable mistake of believing that distance and discipline were a reasonable substitute for presence." Elias said nothing. Sometimes the most useful thing a person could do was simply hold the space open. "I brought the governesses because the physicians told me she needed structure. I brought the tutors because I believed routine might reach her where I could not." The Duke began walking again, slower than before. "Each time one of them left. Each time I received another letter of resignation or found another member of staff sitting stunned in the kitchen at dawn, I told myself the child was beyond ordinary remedy. It was easier than admitting the alternative, that she was not beyond remedy at all." The Duke's jaw tightened briefly. that I had failed her. He said this the way a man says something he has rehearsed in private many times, but never yet spoken aloud. Carefully, and with the particular exhaustion of a weight finally set down. Her mother would have known what to do. Margaret always knew. She understood Lyra in ways I never managed. Even when the child was an infant, he paused. She understood most things I could not. They walked in silence for a while after that. The frost crunched steadily beneath their boots. In the far distance, Blackthorn Hall sat gray and solid against the moorland, its windows catching the low winter light. "Your Grace," Elias said eventually, "the night Lady Ravencroft died. Were you truly in Edinburgh?" The question landed quietly, but it landed. The Duke's stride did not break, but something in the set of his shoulders shifted almost imperceptibly. A long pause followed, long enough that Elias thought he might have miscalculated badly. "I returned a day early," the Duke said at last. "I did not announce myself. I arrived late in the evening and went directly to my study. I heard Margaret at the piano in the ballroom." Another pause. "I heard voices. I assumed she had invited guests without informing me. I went to bed without investigating." His voice had gone very level in the way of a man controlling something large. "In the morning she was dead. The physician said her heart. She was 31 years old and in perfect health, and her heart simply stopped." He did not look at Elias when he said any of this. Elias turned it over carefully. The clockmaker had heard piano music. The Duke had heard voices, plural. 3 servants had left the hall before dawn without explanation. A woman in perfect health, dead of a stopped heart. He thought of the locked cabinet behind the fireplace in the ballroom. He thought of the letters Mrs. Holloway had implied were down there without quite saying so. He thought of Lyra, 2 years old on the night her mother died, drawing the same key over and over again for 6 years in a house full of people who had looked at her work and seen only madness. She had not been drawing from imagination. She had been drawing from memory. The guests arrived on the 22nd of December. 3 carriages came up the forecourt road in the early afternoon, wheels cutting fresh lines through a light snowfall that had begun overnight and showed no intention of stopping. Elias watched from the upstairs landing window as trunks were unloaded and handed down, as women in heavy traveling cloaks and men in greatcoats moved through the entrance porch below with the particular energy of people who had been sitting in confined spaces for several hours and were glad to be done with it. The hall transformed within an afternoon. Greenery appeared along the staircase banister, holly and ivy, tied with dark ribbon. Candles multiplied on every surface. The smell of the house changed from its usual cold stone and beeswax to something warmer, pine and roasting meat drifting up from the kitchens. Distant relatives took the guest rooms on the 3rd floor. An elderly aunt from somewhere near Scarborough claimed the warmest parlor as her personal territory within an hour of arriving, and no one disputed it. Elias stayed largely out of the way. He had no particular objection to the gathering itself. His concern was Lyra. She had known it was coming. 3 days before the first carriage arrived, she had stopped leaving drawings outside his room and started instead leaving them in less expected places, folded into the spine of the natural history book on his reading chair, tucked behind the clock on his mantelpiece, once pressed flat beneath his breakfast plate so that he only found it when he lifted the plate to pass it back. Each one more urgent in feeling than the last, though the subjects remained the same. The key, the ballroom, the portrait, and now, with increasing frequency, a new figure, a man, drawn in profile, broad-shouldered, with a particular watch chain looping from his waistcoat pocket, the fob rendered in careful detail. Elias had studied that figure closely each time. He did not yet know who it was. He found out on the evening of the 23rd. The guests had gathered in the drawing room before dinner, the air thick with candlelight and conversation and the particular social warmth of people performing festivity with genuine feeling. Elias stood near the window with a glass of claret he was not especially drinking and watched the room arrange itself into its natural groupings. Sir Cedric Vale arrived late. He came through the drawing room door with the ease of a man entirely comfortable in other people's houses, shaking hands and inclining his head, and producing the small laugh of someone who had long ago learned that a laugh placed at the right moment could substitute for almost any other social skill. He was perhaps 55, broad across the shoulders, his dark coat well cut and his silver watch chain catching the candlelight as he moved. The fob was a flat disc of dark metal. On its face, a three-pronged symbol. Elias went very still. Across the room, in the doorway that led to the side passage, where she had apparently been standing in the shadows for an indeterminate length of time, Lyra was watching Sir Cedric with an expression that Elias had never seen on her face before. Every other fear he had witnessed in her had been sudden and physical, a response to lightning or loud sound or unexpected touch. This was different. This was old. This was the kind of fear that had been living in a person so long it had stopped being a feeling and become simply a fact of how they stood in a room. Sir Cedric had not yet seen her. Elias moved to the doorway quietly and positioned himself between Lyra and the room with his back to Sir Cedric, blocking the line of sight. She looked up at him. He said nothing, simply gave a small nod, and she slipped back into the passage behind her without a sound. For the remainder of the evening, Sir Cedric moved through the gathering with his easy laugh and his firm handshake, and Elias watched him the way he imagined a naturalist might watch an unfamiliar animal, not with hostility, but with a careful and comprehensive attention. He noted the way Sir Cedric spoke to the Duke, familiar without overstepping, the manner of an old acquaintance who understood the precise value of the relationship and managed it accordingly. He noted the way Sir Cedric's eyes moved across the room periodically in a sweep that was too systematic to be casual. He was checking something, taking inventory of who was present and where. At supper, Elias was seated 4 places from Sir Cedric on the same side of the table, close enough to observe without being in direct conversation. The candles along the center of the table threw warm, unsteady light across the silver and the crystal and the faces of 14 people eating and talking and passing dishes with the comfortable noise of a household briefly restored to its fuller self. Elias watched Sir Cedric cut his meat and smile at something the elderly aunt said, and lift his wine glass with the unhurried confidence of a man who believed himself to be perfectly safe. Then, beneath the table, he felt a small folded paper pressed into his hand. He did not react. He closed his fingers around it and waited until the conversation at his end of the table had filled the moment over completely before glancing down briefly at his lap and unfolding it. A single drawing. Sir Cedric, rendered in a few certain lines, unmistakable, standing beside a fireplace, a door visible behind him, slightly ajar, and on the floor near his feet, suggested in 2 or 3 strokes of charcoal, so light they might almost have been accidental, the shape of a woman lying still. Elias folded the paper and pressed it into his jacket pocket. He did not touch his wine again for the remainder of the evening. He waited 4 days. Not from hesitation, from necessity. The house was full of guests, corridors populated at irregular hours, servants moving between rooms on unpredictable schedules, and Sir Cedric himself seemed to require very little sleep, his lamp burning visible under his door at hours when the rest of the hall had long gone dark. Elias went about his days with deliberate normality, taking meals, exchanging pleasantries, accompanying the Duke on a brief walk after Boxing Day when the snow had packed hard enough to bear weight. He gave no indication to anyone that anything had shifted, but something had shifted considerably. He had looked at Lyra's final drawing until he had memorized every line of it. The woman on the floor near Sir Cedric's feet, the door slightly ajar behind him, the specific proportions of the fireplace beside which the man stood, an arched surround, a carved pilaster on the left side. He had been in that room. He knew that fireplace. It was the ballroom. On the night of the 27th, the house finally quieted early. The elderly aunt had declared herself exhausted after 2 consecutive evenings of cards and retired before 9. The remaining guests followed in stages. By 11 o'clock the hall had settled into its familiar deep silence, broken only by the wind off the moors pressing against the upper windows and the occasional shift of cooling timber in the walls. Elias sat in his room until 11:30. Then he took his oil lamp, kept the flame very low, and went to find Lyra. She was already in the corridor outside the west wing. Of course she was. She was sitting cross-legged on the floorboards in her nightgown with her drawing board on her knees and her charcoal in her hand, though she was not drawing. She was waiting. She looked up when he rounded the corner, and something in her face, not quite relief, but the thing that lives adjacent to it, passed briefly across her expression and was gone. He crouched to her level and held her gaze for a moment. Then he reached into his coat pocket and produced the music box. He had taken it from the library mantelpiece that afternoon, slipping it into his pocket while Mr. Graves was occupied in the entrance hall with a guest's departing luggage. The symbol on the lid caught the lamplight as he turned it in his hands. Lyra's eyes went to it immediately and stayed there with an intensity that confirmed everything he had already understood. He opened it and tilted the empty velvet tray toward her. She reached into the collar of her nightgown and drew out a fine chain. At the end of it hung a key, long and slender, with a three-pronged bow. She had been wearing it against her skin, he understood, for God knew how long. Keeping it the only way a child in a house full of adults could keep anything safely. On her person, hidden, never set down. She unclasped the chain and placed the key in his palm. They went through the servant passage together, Lyra leading with the calm certainty of someone who had made this particular journey many times alone. Through the coal store, along the narrow underground corridor, up through the anterooms stacked with sheeted furniture, and into the west wing. Their two shadows moved long and wavering across the stone walls in the lamplight. The ballroom doors stood as he had left them, slightly ajar. Inside, the sheeted furniture sat in its silent rows, and the arched windows held rectangles of dark blue winter sky. The portrait above the fireplace watched them cross the room. Elias crouched at the base of the left pilaster and found the seam immediately, running his thumbnail along it until he located the slight depression at the upper right corner that served as a release point. He pressed it. A soft click, and the stone panel shifted inward a fraction. He drew it open. Inside the cabinet, in a space roughly the size of a document box, sat a bundle of letters tied with black ribbon, and beneath them a small leather journal, its cover warped slightly with age and damp. He lifted both out carefully and set them on the hearthstone, then looked at Lyra. She was watching with her hands pressed flat against her thighs, very still. He untied the ribbon. The letters were in a woman's hand, fluid, educated, written with the slight backward lean of someone who had learned their script from a continental tutor. Lady Ravencroft. He read quickly and carefully by lamplight. Lyra sitting close beside him now, closer than she had ever voluntarily positioned herself to another person in his presence. The early letters were practical, household accounts, arrangements, the ordinary correspondence of an estate wife. But as the dates progressed through the summer and into the early autumn of 1858, the tone changed. She had discovered something in the estate ledgers. Discrepancies, at first small enough to question whether they were errors, then large enough that errors became an impossible explanation. Money moved from the estate accounts to a private arrangement she had no knowledge of. The name that appeared repeatedly in the marginal notations she had made in her careful hand was Sir Cedric Vale. She had written to him once, directly, requesting explanation. The final letter in the bundle, dated 3 weeks before her death, was addressed to her solicitor in York. In it she outlined the full extent of what she had uncovered. A systematic financial betrayal running across 7 years, Sir Cedric siphoning funds from the Ravencroft estate accounts through a series of false land transactions, using his position as a trusted family acquaintance to remain above suspicion. She had gathered enough documentation to expose him entirely. She intended to travel to York the following week, with Lyra, and not return to Blackthorn Hall until the matter was settled. She never made that journey. Elias set the letter down and opened the journal. The final entry was dated the 14th of October, 1858, 2 days before Lady Ravencroft died. It was brief. She had written that Sir Cedric had arrived at the hall unexpectedly that evening, that she had not sent for him, that she intended to keep the journal and the letters locked away until she reached York, and that if anything prevented her from making that journey, she hoped whoever found these pages would understand what they meant. The entry ended mid-sentence. The ballroom was very quiet around them. Elias sat with the open journal in his hands and the lamplight steady on the page, and he understood now the full shape of what Lyra had been carrying alone in this silent house for 6 years. She had been 2 years old. She had not understood the words, or the documents, or the financial betrayal. But she had been there that night, had seen something in that ballroom that had taken her voice clean away and replaced it with charcoal and paper and a locked cabinet and a key worn against her heart, waiting, with a patience that shamed every adult in the building, for someone to finally sit down and pay attention. He closed the journal gently. Beside him, Lyra reached out and placed her small hand over his for just a moment, barely 3 seconds. The first time she had voluntarily touched another person in 6 years, and then withdrew it. He looked at her. Her eyes were wet, but her face was steady. She gave him the same small, deliberate nod she had given him in the corridor the night of the storm, when he had pointed at the portrait and she had confirmed everything. He was at the Duke's study door before dawn. The Duke read everything twice. Elias sat across the desk and said nothing while he did it. The fire in the study had burned low by the time they had arrived at it. Elias had knocked at 4:30 in the morning, which had produced a long silence before the door opened, and the Duke appeared fully dressed, as though sleep had not been seriously attempted that night anyway. He had looked at the journal and the bundle of letters in Elias's hands, and something in his face had shifted in a way that suggested he had been waiting, without knowing it, for exactly this moment for 6 years. He read slowly, thoroughly. He set each letter down with care after finishing it, aligning the edges against the desk surface in a precise stack, which Elias understood was the Duke's way of managing what was happening inside him while his hands had something ordered to do. When he reached the final journal entry, the one that ended mid-sentence, he stopped and sat very still for a long moment with his hand flat on the open page. Then he looked up. "She came to me," he said quietly, 2 days before she died. "She told me she needed to speak with me about the estate accounts. I told her I was occupied and that it could wait until the following week." He looked back at the journal. "I was writing letters. Parliamentary correspondence, a pause so long the fire had time to shift and settle. It could not wait until the following week." Elias said nothing. There was nothing useful to say. What happened next unfolded not with the dramatic speed of sensation novels, but with the quieter and more permanent machinery of truth finding its level. The Duke sent a letter to his solicitor in York that same morning by urgent postwriter. A second letter went to a magistrate he knew personally from his parliamentary years. Sir Cedric, who had planned to remain at Blackthorn Hall through the new year, found himself instead the subject of a private meeting with the Duke in the study on the morning of the 29th of December that lasted 2 hours, and produced no raised voices that anyone in the household could report hearing. Whatever was said behind that closed door, Sir Cedric emerged from it a changed color. His trunks were packed and loaded onto a carriage before luncheon. He did not say farewell to the other guests. He did not look back at the hall as the carriage moved down the forecourt road. He was gone before the snow had finished melting off the drive. The remaining guests departed over the following days, and January settled over Blackthorn Hall with its customary gray indifference. But something had altered in the quality of the silence inside the house. The old silence had been the kind that accumulates around secrets, heavy, self-conscious, full of things being carefully avoided. The new silence was simply winter, ordinary and clean. The West Wing was opened in February. The Duke organized it himself, which surprised the household staff considerably. He directed the removal of the sheeting from the furniture, the airing of the rooms, the cleaning of the windows that had grown opaque with 6 years of undisturbed grime. He stood for a long time in the ballroom looking at his wife's portrait, and he did not seal the room again when he left it. The portrait stayed where it was, above the fireplace. Lyra began walking the West Wing corridors within the week. The change in her was gradual rather than sudden, which was perhaps why it felt so thorough. She began appearing at mealtimes, not in the dining room immediately, but at the kitchen table with Mrs. Holloway, who set a place for her, without ceremony, and treated the development with the brisk matter-of-factness of someone who had been expecting it for some time. The housemaids stopped flinching when she appeared around corners. The footmen learned that she would walk alongside them without incident if they simply went about their work without making a performance of her presence. She still drew constantly, but the drawings changed. Ravens gave way to garden birds. Locked doors gave way to open windows. The key appeared less frequently, and when it did, it was no longer the central subject. It appeared in the margins, incidentally, the way a thing appears when it has lost its urgency. Elias's role shifted naturally through those months. Less formal instruction, more simply being present, reading in the same room, walking the grounds in companionable quiet, occasionally pointing at things in the natural history volume and letting her respond as she chose. He was aware, in a way he did not examine too closely, that he had stopped thinking of his position as temporary. Spring came to Yorkshire with its usual unhurried confidence. warming the stone walls of the hall from the outside in and coaxing the garden back from its winter severity. The moors turned from brown to a tentative green. The fog that had met Elias on his first evening thinned and retreated. The forecourt that had looked so forbidding in October lamplight looked, on a mild April afternoon, almost welcoming. He was in the garden on a Thursday when Lyra found him. She had her drawing board under one arm and settled herself on the stone bench beside him without any of the careful calibration that had once preceded every interaction. She simply sat, the way people sit beside someone whose company they have stopped questioning, and opened her board across her knees. She was drawing the roses climbing the south garden wall, their first blooms just opening in pale pink clusters against the old stone. She drew with the same precision she brought to everything. Unhurried, certain, each line placed with full intention. Elias read his book. The garden was warm and the bees had found the early flowers, and somewhere above the hall roof a thrush was working through its full repertoire with considerable self-satisfaction. It was, Elias thought, an entirely ordinary afternoon. The particular kind of ordinary that takes a long time to arrive and is worth considerably more than it appears on the surface. After a while Lyra stopped drawing. He felt rather than heard the change, the small stillness of someone gathering something up inside themselves. He did not look up from his book immediately. He waited, the way he had learned to wait with her, without pressure or expectation. Then, in a voice that was quiet and a little rough from long disuse, but entirely clear, "Will you stay until summer?" Elias lowered his book. She was looking at the roses rather than at him, her charcoal held loosely in her fingers, her dark eyes steady on the pale blooms opening slowly against the warm stone wall. She asked the question the way someone asks something they genuinely do not know the answer to, with a directness that had nothing rehearsed about it and everything to do with the particular courage it takes to want something after a long time of wanting nothing at all. He looked at her for a moment. "Yes," he said simply. She gave one small nod, the same deliberate nod he had come to know well, and returned to her drawing. The thrush continued its performance overhead. The roses continued their unhurried opening against the wall. And for the first time since the October evening 6 years ago when the world had gone wrong in a ballroom at the end of a sealed corridor, the child smiled. Not widely, not with any performance about it. Just a small, real, private smile directed at the roses, or perhaps at nothing in particular, at the warmth of the afternoon, at the bees and the early flowers, at the simple fact of sitting in a garden beside someone who had answered yes. It was enough. It was, in every way that mattered, everything.